and everybody's looking for a place to put their money because apparently cash is still trash to some people on Wall Street. People have been looking to cryptocurrencies, and everybody still has their eyes on Bitcoin and Ethereum. And that's why we noted at the top of the show is where it's gone year to date and the incredible returns that it's had. Lucky for us today, though, we have Lynn with us. Lynn covers cryptocurrency on Stockwaves and has a very interesting opinion on it. Because Lynn, I just want to bring you in. You recently put out a note that says Bitcoin and the broad crypto space continue to be in correction mode in recent weeks. It looks like it could certainly have further down to go before it's over. And you go on to say, however, I continue to have a structurally bullish view on Bitcoin, likely over the next year and with higher conviction over the next 5 years. Why is that?
Well, so partially it's separating between a trading call and a kind of a fundamentals call. And so if you look at the trading aspects, basically the reason I'm saying it could go lower is because we don't really have a confirmed bottom in place yet, and we see things like today. But if you notice, for example, like, at least as I'm talking now, Bitcoin has held up pretty well considering the down day in the markets, right? For how much volatility that asset has, it actually hasn't been as much of a bloodbath as people might suspect. And a lot of that is because we're seeing that there's on-chain indicators. So basically, with Bitcoin, because the ledger's open, we can kind of do some interesting statistical analysis on it, like what kind of entities are buying, what kind of entities are selling. And right now, Bitcoin is at the spend output like profit line, which is basically saying that it's around the cost basis where if people continue selling now, a lot of them would be selling at a loss. And so if you look at bull market, normally in Bitcoin bull markets, a lot of corrections come down to this line where people are willing to sell and lock in gains, but they won't sell at a loss because they still have a generally bullish outlook. And it's only in more bear markets where you see people willing to break below that line and then start selling at a loss. So we saw that this summer during the big correction, and then of course you saw it during major other liquidation events. You saw it in March 2020, and you saw it during the down leg of prior massive bear markets. And so you kind of can consider this somewhat of a support level, right? So it's breakable, but until it breaks it, kind of the inclination is to be on the side of it, on the bullish side. And then in addition, when you look at other on-chain indicators, most of them look either neutral or constructive for Bitcoin, meaning that you don't really have long-term holders selling, you have some tightness in the market. And so in terms of those overall adoption fundamentals, it still looks pretty constructive. But of course, this is crypto, so you can have crazy moves in a day, right? You can have a billionaire come out and just bought a ton of it. The price goes crazy, or you could have just a bloodbath overnight, and then because there's offshore leverage, liquidations happen, you can get like a $5,000 Bitcoin down candle, overnight. So there's crazy events that can happen, but I'd say the probability is still somewhat constructive, even though the overall macro environment is challenging. And what makes kind of this cycle different is that now Bitcoin is big enough to be influenced by more of these macro events because there's institutions on board, and overall just the size of the market, the number of participants, it ties it in, somewhat more closely to some of the things we're seeing that Powell says, or these other macro events that happen.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, what's your upside target though?
So I think it has a decent shot of getting higher into the five figures. As we go into 2022, the longer we look out, I mean, I think my base case is that it'll eventually see six figures. Now there are things that could deviate that from that trend, but basically what I'm kind of modeling is that you know, in a world where you have a lot of currencies failing, and it's a very accessible asset, right? So anyone with a smartphone can pretty much access it, unlike say U.S. securities, right? So someone in Africa has trouble accessing the S&P 500, but they have less access. I mean, they have less trouble accessing Bitcoin. And so I think that basically we're still seeing this kind of structural S-curve type of adoption that you normally see with like new technologies like mobile phones and things like that, where it's becoming more normal for institutions and individuals to have Bitcoin or in some cases other cryptos as a percentage of their portfolios. Obviously, there are people that go all into it, but the more common thing is that people just pick up a little bit on the side and kind of add it to their overall asset mix. And I think that trend still probably has legs. The further we look out into the years, and then you can kind of model that with some kind of price ratios to find out how that potential buying pressure, if you onload another 100 million people, what does that look like in terms of price? And so overall, I'm still bullish. I try to avoid specific price targets because again, some of those really big spikes you saw in the past, those are really liquid spikes, right? So predicting whether or not they're going to happen and when is hard. But I think basically as we look out further, I think there's a decent shot we break above prior highs in 2022. And then I think that, six figures is not a silly number the further you look out.
Yeah, we've had El Salvador adopt Bitcoin. We have MicroStrategy buying more Bitcoins as the drop continues. We have Jack Dorsey coming out, so that, stepping down from Twitter, wanting to focus more on blockchain technology and Bitcoin specifically. I mean, what's the catalyst to push it higher from here? I mean, is it just institutional buying at this point?
So some of the catalyst is often as simple as that there's just not enough sellers. And so that's why I look at the on-chain indicators to see basically you can look for these supply shocks where there's just not really people selling anymore. And yet there's still kind of a slow trickle of general adoption going on. And so, basically that's kind of the catalyst for another leg up. Now, and if you get an environment where you have kind of slowing growth, but inflation is still running pretty hot, then depending on, as long as there's no liquidation shocks, where everything, all correlations go to one, everything goes down. If you don't have those types of liquidations, you can still see something like Bitcoin grind up because Bitcoin's not subject to profit margins being squeezed. It's not subject to those other things. Now it varies. It's more often than not a risk on asset. So that's the big challenge going against it in that slowing growth environment. But it's also, in theory, a decent stagflationary environment in a similar way that gold can be, especially if it gets bigger and a little bit more widely held. And so my overall catalyst is simply that because the incoming supply is so low and a lot of the existing supply is held in very, very tight hands while there's still kind of a slow adoption period, that's what can eventually cause the next leg up.